Hey there and welcome back to Rimworld. My name is Pete and today we finally complete another episode of our Rimworld Extreme Desert Challenge. I know it's been a while and I apologize for that, but I hope we're going to have a great episode to make up for it. Now, last time we left off after a pretty eventful episode, in which, among other things, Steak and Red Hawk became a couple. They are now sharing a bed and occasionally doing other things, while our third colonist Edmo, who also had his sights set on Red Hawk, is currently wandering around the desert in a slightly less stable state of mind. Speaking of which, I have actually installed a small mod to make those state of minds a bit more obvious for you. You may have noticed that at the top of the screen we now have color-coded mood bars behind our colonists, which was suggested to me in the comments of the last episode, and that is hopefully going to make it a bit more easy for you to follow along. Now, to get us started in today's episode, we'll have both Red Hawk and Steak grab breakfast, before Red Hawk then continues mining out more space for the storage room. With Steak, meanwhile, we are going to construct ourselves a fueled stove, because we still have plenty of meat lying around, but no vegetables to make kibble with, so instead I think we can afford the luxury to prepare some simple meals. Now, as the name already suggests, this stove of course needs fuel, wood in our case, but thanks to our small cactus farm we have plenty of that, and can therefore now afford 50 units to make food. And as I said, we're going for simple meals here, that is really the only option we have, and even though Edmo is the better cook, Steak will have to take care of this, since his companion is still sleeping. Eventually then Edmo's psychotic state comes to an end, and so does Steak's cooking session, so we now have a few probably not expertly made simple meals. Edmo himself meanwhile takes care of the cacti and then of some hauling, and then it's time for some crafting, a skill that he is also pretty decent at. Now, both Red Hawk and Steak are currently wearing some form of headgear. The only one who doesn't is Edmo himself, so he is now going to make himself a lovely little cowboy hat. The main purpose of this hat is going to be heat protection. As you can see, it doesn't really offer any other substantial benefits, and the social impact bonus is also more or less lost on Edmo. Still, it's cheap to make and will prepare him for a potential heat wave, and of course it also looks nice. And so, after a day of research, mining, mental breaks and tailoring, our small colony is slowly heading off to bed, and we can skip ahead to the next morning. Or, in Edmo's case, to just a few hours later. His quick sleeper trait is certainly noticeable, and well rested he can now construct a wooden shelf in our dining room. Now, we will use this to store meals and eventually also kibble. That way they are a bit more accessible, but they're still not causing any beauty penalties. And the day also continues with more construction for Edmo. Up next is another armchair, this time for the Stonecutters Table. Over the last few episodes we have been using this quite extensively to make new building materials, so I think the least we can do is provide some comfort for those who do the work. Now, this will take a while, so in the meantime it's no surprise to eventually see Red Hawk start off her day. And again, mining is back on the schedule because our storage room is not finished yet. Unfortunately, Red Hawk's day then takes a bit of a wrong turn, because instead of giving her strength for the day, her breakfast only gives her food poisoning. And yes, it says it right here, this could have been avoided with a more skilled cook, but well, we all saw what Edmo was doing, and it was certainly not being a productive member of this colony. Now, at least today the picture is a slightly different one. The cloth armchair in the stone cutting room is now finished. It is nothing spectacular, but it will definitely make working here a bit more pleasant. It also appears as if Edmo simply can't stop himself from trying to flirt with Red Hawk, which might actually not bode too well for the future of our colony. So perhaps we do in fact have to figure out some elaborate means to keep those two separated. For the time being, it doesn't cause any major problems though, so Redhawk simply keeps mining undeterred by the advances, while Edmo is testing out the new armchair and makes stone blocks, and Steak continues researching. In the late afternoon then, Redhawk simply can't catch a break. Her next meal gives her food poisoning again. The first one from the morning has not even worn off yet, and this only reinforces the need to instruct someone else to do the cooking in the future. On the bright side, a little later that evening we have a quest pop up, and the frightened duck here actually seems to be quite easy. To complete it, we have to take care of a duck for 13 days, which in itself is of course very much manageable. However, during that time we will also have to fend off 2 raids. Now, the rough size estimation of those raids here is actually something I am moderately comfortable with, and one of the rewards here is another colonist, so this quest seems to be very intriguing. Now, what's interesting is we can actually take a look at that colonist right here and now, and what we're seeing here is someone who I'm honestly not overly interested in. With Redhawk already proficient in the medical skill, we don't desperately need a second colonist with that skill set. As a capable melee fighter, we also have Edmo around, and another beautiful colonist could cause additional problems just like Redhawk is already doing. I'm also a bit cautious because I don't think we should grow our colony too quickly. This will of course affect the size of raids and other things, and it could become a problem if we only have the people but not the defenses to go along with them. So while I could see us accept this quest, it is likely going to be for a different reward. For the time being though, we can wrap up another day out here in the desert, our storage room has been sufficiently mined out, and our colonists are once again getting some rest now. On the next morning then, we are starting things off with a fairly sizable hauling job for Edmo. All of these are marble stone chunks, which we will in a few hours begin turning into stone blocks. And that process is a task for Redhawk. In the comfort of the new armchair, she can now make marble blocks for us, while Edmo keeps hauling and Steak focuses on research. Around noon, Edmo then takes a quick break to chop some wood and also to grab a meal, and he now also suffers a familiar fate and contracts food poisoning. Lucky for us that we have already more or less burned through our supply of simple meals, and even though kibble is not exactly risk-free, I think it's safe to say that we've had a much better experience with it. To somewhat make up for his troubles, Edmo now experiences an inspiration, and for the next 8 days he will now move much faster. Considering how the food poisoning also slows him down, this will of course come in handy, even though it will not entirely negate all the penalties. Now we're skipping ahead to the late evening here. Redhawk and Steak have both finished their jobs for today, and Edmo is also hauling back the last bits of wood, and so another day in the desert slowly comes to an end. The next one then begins with, yes, another round of food poisoning. This time it's Steak's turn and kibble is the reason. Luckily for us though, Steak won't have to do a lot of moving around, as he can now simply sit down and continue researching. Redhawk meanwhile can grab even more marble chunks, while Edmo sows out new cactus plants, and a short while later we can also do some redecorating. We currently have 4 flower pots in a spare bedroom that we're not using, so we might as well use those to improve the beauty of the bedrooms that we are using, and that is a task that only requires a bit of hauling and planting and is therefore quickly completed. Now at this point you can also see why we made all those marble blocks earlier, because our 2 bedrooms are now getting a proper floor. In the last episode we already used marble tiles to create a small walkway inside of our base, however they are not only good for getting around faster, but also for aesthetics. And speaking of beautiful things, just 1 episode after the 2 of them have officially become lovers, Steak and Redhawk have now become engaged. So Red Hawk will now in fact become a member of the Steak family, and depending on how quickly the two of them want to get this over with, we might even see their wedding take place in this episode. For today though, nothing else exciting happens until darkness sets across the desert, at which point, believe it or not, Red Hawk once again suffers food poisoning. Yes, this is already her third time in this episode, and, well, going to bed is probably the best choice at this point. Now, on the next morning, Edmo begins his day with more field work, while Red Hawk sits down in front of the Stonecutters Table and Steak puts down more marble flooring. He is eventually joined by Edmo, and really that is pretty much all that happens during this day. In the early evening, both of our bedrooms are finished, and their beauty ratings have been substantially increased. The day then comes to an end with no more food poisonings for a change, and as the next morning arrives, it is time for some trading. We have a decent number of items in our storage room that I don't see us use anytime soon. Most of those are low-value melee weapons or clothing items, so let's pay another visit to our good friends of the Black Troska tribe. Since she has the highest social skill, Red Hawk will of course lead this caravan, and apart from a bit of kibble and the bedroll, she will take all of those items I just mentioned. We will also give her 500 silver to perhaps buy something a little more expensive. I am not overly optimistic that our neighbors actually have something of interest, but it's generally better to be prepared, and we don't really need the silver for anything else anyway. So here we can now see Red Hawk leave for her short journey, which means Edmo can now also finally focus all of his attention on the work at hand. For the moment, that is only a bit of cleaning, something our base desperately needs after all those food poisonings, but in the afternoon Edmo can construct another wooden shelf. This one will be used to hold weaponry, and being placed in the middle of the base, switching weapons mid-combat should hopefully be made just a tiny bit easier, but that could be enough to give us the edge we need. For the moment, we'll use this to store the machine pistol as well as the thrombohorn. I think those are the weapons that we will use frequently. Over on the world map, meanwhile, we can see that Red Hawk is about to reach her destination, and yes indeed, here she is, safely at the gates of the Black Troska tribe. So let's do some trading, and we can sell all of the weapons and clothing items we brought for a grand profit of 33 silver. Unfortunately, that is also all we're going to do here. The times where we had to shell out money for food are luckily over, so 33 silver richer, Red Hawk can now make the return trip back to the base. And back home we're seeing a bit more cactus farming from Edmo, and with Red Hawk's return coming up, let's also put down a marriage spot here. Perhaps that encourages her and Steak to get things over with in today's episode. Just in time then, Red Hawk also makes it back safely. She does not have to sleep out in the desert and instead can lie down next to her future husband. Now at this point we also only have one more day to make a decision regarding the Frightened Duck quest. And again, I think we should take this one. However, not for goodwill or the addition of another colonist, but instead for a bit more royal favor for Steak. Now, I have paid attention, this is not going to give him a new title, so he will not all of a sudden make crazy demands, but eventually we do want that next title, and this gets him one step closer. Now, here we go, the duck has arrived via transport, and because we do not want it to eat our plants, let's put it inside of the storage room. That way it will only feed on the kibble, and that will be much less detrimental to our food reserves. Now, since this duck is going to stay with us for at least 13 days, I think we can also afford to give it a new name. As always, this one was chosen from the list of patrons in the naming rights tier and above, and so the duck now goes by the name Walter, after patron Walter Dank. And that is really all we have to do for this quest, at least for the moment. The duck will take care of itself, and inside of the storage room it should be safe for 13 days, which leaves us to worry about the 2 raids that we of course still have coming up. Speaking of which, I think it can't hurt to slightly upgrade our defenses at this point. The quest said that we should be facing a group of 5 enemies, but this estimation is not always correct and the group could in fact be larger, so I think 2 more traps here sure can't hurt. And since we also still have plenty of marble lying around, let us actually put some down inside of the storage room as well. That is going to make the place at least a little less ugly, and it will also give our colonists a slight movement speed increase, so in a few hours our base should operate a bit more efficiently. Before it can come to that, however, we have a raid coming in, and interestingly enough, this one is not part of the quest, because these are not tribespeople. Instead, we are facing 6 more or less heavily armed attackers here, all of them equipped with ranged weaponry, so this could get interesting. At least for the moment though, they are not attacking immediately, and so we can send Redhawk out on a small mining expedition, because no matter how this goes, I think one thing is guaranteed: we will most definitely lose a few traps in the process, so grabbing some steel here to replace them seems like a sensible idea to me. Unfortunately then, it also doesn't take too long until our enemies have finished their preparations, and so we should now move Redhawk back into the safety of our base. Now, the plan for this fight is of course to not engage in a straight-up shootout, because we are sadly pretty severely outnumbered. So instead we'll try our best to lure the enemies into our traps by occasionally taking potshots at them through our base entrances and then immediately retreating back into safety. And as you can see, for our first victim here, that works like a charm. So, 5 more traps, 5 more enemies to go. The next one is then lured to their death at the northern entrance by Redhawk, while just a few moments later, number 3 goes down in the south. In the meantime, one of our enemies has unfortunately also set fire to the cotton plants, so at this point we should try to end this fight quickly, otherwise we might lose a bunch of crops. And as if the game had heard me say that, our enemies now suffer another casualty near the gate that Steak is guarding, and that marks number 4, causing them to flee. We are unfortunately not able to land any shots with Admo here as they retreat, but at least Steak gets to put out the fire just in time. For the remainder of the evening, our colonists are now digging graves and hauling weaponry back into the storage room. One of our enemies actually carried an assault rifle, which could be useful for some of our more experienced shooters. Eventually though, everyone heads off to bed with a few corpses still left outside, so the remaining cleanup work has to wait until the next morning. Thanks to the combined efforts of Admo and Redhawk, those corpses are quickly buried though, and Admo is also already working on the defenses. Since this was not one of the raids advertised in the quest, we will have 2 more coming up soon, and even though those will only be tribal raids and therefore likely a bit weaker, let us prepare for them as best as we can. Since this is using some steel, Redhawk can also continue mining now, while Steak continues work in the storage room and Admo is harvesting rice. And since we have learned from our mistakes, he will now also be the one to prepare a few more simple meals. I don't think we need another spread of food poisoning anytime soon. A few hours later then, all of the rice has been harvested and the last meals have been prepared. Redhawk has also mined enough steel so that we now have 6 traps back up and running again. Still, she can now continue to mine more while the boys get to work in the storage room. As you can see here, both of their construction skills are rising quickly. Admo is already at level 9 and overall looking absolutely fantastic, while Steak is still slightly ahead of him at level 11 with a few other good skills as well. And that is more or less how this day, and with that also this episode, comes to an end. Walter's pursuers have not yet shown up, but I'm sure they will eventually. Redhawk and Steak have also not yet begun their wedding ceremony, so we do have a few things to look forward to in the next video. For today, let us now make the cut here. I'm not quite sure if you've noticed, but I'm slowly starting to lose my voice. I'm not quite sure why, to be honest. Perhaps I've had one too many Zoom calls over the week. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, then I would of course be very happy if you could leave a thumbs up. And if you like what I'm doing and want to support me and my channel further, then you can of course go ahead and subscribe to stay up to date, and perhaps also check out and maybe even pledge to the Pete Complete Patreon. Who knows, maybe your name will be the next one to appear in this series. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.